In a small courthouse in downtown Portland, the air was thick with tension as 11-year-old Amy Chen clutched her grandmother's hand. The wooden benches creaked beneath them as they waited for their case to be called. This wasn't how Amy had imagined spending her summer break, but here she was, about to face one of the biggest challenges of her young life. 3 months earlier, Amy's grandmother had fallen victim to a sophisticated real estate scam. A smooth-talking lawyer had convinced her to sign over the deed to their family restaurant, a beloved establishment that had been serving the community for over 30 years. The lawyer had promised to help refinance the property to save it from foreclosure, but instead, he had transferred ownership to a development company, leaving the Chen family on the verge of losing everything. The restaurant wasn't just a business, it was Amy's second home. She had grown up watching her grandmother create magic in that kitchen, learning family recipes passed down through generations. The worn wooden tables and familiar faces of regular customers were woven into the fabric of her childhood. Now, all of that was threatened by a man in an expensive suit who thought he could take advantage of a grandmother who spoke broken English. Next case, Chen vs. Morrison Legal Associates, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Amy felt her grandmother's hand trembling as they made their way to the front. Mr. Morrison, the lawyer who had deceived them, sat at the opposite table, looking confident and unbothered. His designer watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights as he shuffled through his papers, not even bothering to look their way. Their own attorney, a kind-hearted public defender named Mrs. Rodriguez, had worked tirelessly to build their case, but Amy knew they were fighting an uphill battle. Morrison had a reputation for these kinds of deals, yet somehow, he always managed to stay just within the bounds of legality. As the judge entered the courtroom, Amy noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Peeking out of Morrison's briefcase was a familiar-looking document, one with her grandmother's signature. But something wasn't right. Amy had been there when her grandmother signed the papers, and she remembered exactly how her grandmother formed her characters, especially the unique way she wrote certain Chinese characters in her name. The signature on the document visible from Morrison's briefcase was different. Amy had spent countless hours practicing her own signature under her grandmother's guidance, learning the precise strokes and their meaning. The signature she glimpsed now lacked the distinctive flourish her grandmother always used, a detail so small that most people would miss it, but Amy knew better. Her heart pounding, Amy quickly scribbled a note to Mrs. Rodriguez. Their attorney's eyes widened as she read it, and she immediately requested permission to approach the bench. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver-streaked hair, listened intently as Mrs. Rodriguez whispered something, occasionally glancing at Amy. What happened next would change everything. The judge called Amy to the witness stand, an unusual move that caused murmurs to ripple through the courtroom. Morrison's smug expression faltered slightly as the small figure in a neat blue dress made her way to the front. "Young lady," the judge began, her voice gentler than before, "I understand you have something important to tell this court about the documents in question?" Amy took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the wooden railing of the witness box. She looked at her grandmother, who gave her an encouraging nod, then turned to face the courtroom. The words she was about to speak would not only expose a corrupt lawyer but would also teach everyone present that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room can come from the most unexpected source. The courtroom fell silent as Amy began to explain what she had noticed. Even the usually stoic bailiff leaned forward slightly, listening intently to every word. This was more than just a case about a restaurant now, it was about truth, justice, and the courage of a little girl who refused to let her family's legacy be stolen by someone who thought he could get away with it because no one would notice the details that mattered most. Amy's voice, though soft, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom as she began to explain. Years of watching her grandmother sign documents for the restaurant had taught her every detail of that signature. She described how her grandmother always paused before writing the final character of her name, a habit formed from years of careful practice. "My grandmother taught me that our signature is like our honor," Amy explained, her confidence growing with each word. "She showed me how each stroke has meaning, especially the way she writes our family name. The signature on those papers, it's missing her special mark." The judge turned to Mr. Morrison, whose confident smile had completely vanished. "Counselor, would you please present the documents in question?" Morrison hesitated, his fingers drumming nervously on his briefcase. "Your Honor, I don't see how a child's observation about handwriting could be considered credible evidence." "Nevertheless, I'd like to see them," the judge insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. As Morrison reluctantly approached the bench with the documents, Amy's grandmother sat straighter in her chair. Even without understanding every word being spoken, she could sense the shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. Mrs. Rodriguez requested permission to bring forward several other documents bearing Mrs. Chen's authentic signature for comparison. The judge called for a handwriting expert who happened to be in the courthouse that day for another case. As they waited, Amy shared more details about the day the papers were supposedly signed. She remembered it clearly because it was the same day as her school science fair. "Grandmother couldn't have signed those papers at 2 p.m. that day," Amy stated firmly. "She was at my school, watching me present my project about traditional Chinese herbs. We have pictures, and my teacher was there too." Mrs. Rodriguez quickly produced the photographs from that day, showing Amy's grandmother beaming proudly beside a display board covered in carefully pressed herbs and detailed descriptions. The timestamp on the photos was unmistakable. The handwriting expert arrived, a distinguished-looking man with round glasses and a careful manner. He examined both sets of documents under bright light, occasionally making notes and taking measurements. The courtroom remained silent, the tension building with each passing minute. Meanwhile, Morrison's composure continued to crack. He loosened his expensive tie and kept glancing at his phone, as if hoping for some kind of rescue. His junior associate, a young lawyer fresh out of law school, looked increasingly uncomfortable. The expert's findings were decisive. Not only was the signature on Morrison's documents inconsistent with Mrs. Chen's known signature, but he also identified several other irregularities in the paperwork. The dates on some pages appeared to have been altered, and there were inconsistencies in the document's printer metadata. As these details emerged, the junior associate suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, I need to make a statement," he announced, his voice shaking. Morrison tried to grab his arm, but the young lawyer stepped away. I can't be part of this anymore." The next 30 minutes revealed a pattern of fraudulent practices at Morrison Legal Associates. The junior associate explained how Morrison had bragged about targeting immigrant business owners, assuming they wouldn't understand the legal system well enough to fight back. He had a network of contacts in real estate development who would quickly flip the properties, making it nearly impossible to reverse the transactions once completed. Amy watched as her grandmother wiped tears from her eyes, understanding enough to know that things were turning in their favor. The other restaurant owners in their community who had lost their businesses to similar schemes might have a chance at justice too. The judge's face grew sterner with each new revelation. She ordered an immediate freeze on all assets related to the case and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. Morrison, now ashen-faced, was quickly surrounded by court officers. But Amy wasn't focused on Morrison's downfall. Instead, she rushed to her grandmother's side, hugging her tightly as their community members in the gallery broke into applause. The restaurant wouldn't just be saved, its story would become a symbol of hope for others facing similar battles. Mrs. Rodriguez gathered their belongings, smiling broadly. "Amy," she said, kneeling down to the girl's level, "do you know what you did today? You showed everyone that justice doesn't always need complicated legal arguments. Sometimes it just needs someone brave enough to speak up for what's right." As they left the courthouse that afternoon, reporters gathered on the steps wanted to hear their story. But Amy's grandmother had other plans. "Today's special day," she announced in her accented English. "We go restaurant, make celebration dinner. Everyone welcome." That evening, the Chen family restaurant was filled with more customers than ever before. The air was rich with the aroma of Mrs. Chen's special dumplings, and the sound of laughter and conversation filled every corner. Amy helped serve dishes, just as she had done countless times before, but now with a new understanding of what it meant to protect the things you love. Local business owners stopped by to shake Mrs. Chen's hand and hear the full story. Many of them had similar experiences but had been too afraid to fight back. Amy's courage had given them hope and a roadmap for seeking justice. News of what happened in the courtroom spread quickly through the city's immigrant business community. The following weeks brought significant changes not just for the Chen family, but for the entire neighborhood. The district attorney's office launched a full investigation into Morrison Legal Associates, and more victims began coming forward with similar stories. Amy noticed how differently people looked at her grandmother now. Mrs. Chen was no longer seen as just the sweet lady who made the best dumplings in town. She had become a symbol of resistance against corruption. Regular customers would stop by just to congratulate them, often sharing their own stories of dealing with predatory businesspeople. One morning, as Amy helped her grandmother prep vegetables for the day's service, a well-dressed woman entered the restaurant before opening hours. She introduced herself as Mrs. Patel, representing a group of small business owners from the area. Her family's jewelry store had been targeted by Morrison's firm the previous year, and they had lost everything. "Your courage has given us hope," Mrs. Patel told them, her eyes glistening. "We've formed an association to protect small business owners from these schemes. We would be honored if Mrs. Chen would join our advisory board." Amy translated for her grandmother, watching as understanding dawned on Mrs. Chen's face. The older woman wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for Mrs. Patel to sit down. Through Amy's translation, they spent the next hour sharing experiences and ideas. The restaurant became more than just a place to eat, it transformed into an unofficial community center. Every Tuesday evening, after closing time, business owners would gather around the large round table in the corner. They shared documents, discussed legal strategies, and warned each other about suspicious offers. Mrs. Rodriguez, their attorney from the court case, volunteered her time to provide basic legal education to the group. Amy found herself taking on new responsibilities. Besides helping in the kitchen and waiting tables, she began teaching basic English legal terms to the older business owners. Her grandmother beamed with pride watching her granddaughter explain the difference between lease and deed to their neighbors. The local newspaper ran a feature story about their case, focusing on how Amy's attention to detail had cracked it open. The reporter asked Amy what made her so observant. She thought about it for a moment before answering, "In our restaurant, grandmother always says small details make big difference. One extra minute cooking dumpling can change everything. Same with signatures, small details tell true story." The story caught the attention of a state senator who had been working on legislation to protect small business owners from predatory practices. She visited the restaurant one evening, ordering a bowl of noodles and listening intently as community members shared their experiences. Amy sat nearby, helping to translate when needed, amazed at how their small victory was sparking bigger changes. But not everything was smooth sailing. Some of Morrison's associates, angry about the investigation, tried to spread rumors about the restaurant's health code compliance. Health inspectors showed up 3 times in 2 weeks, but each time they found the kitchen spotless. Mrs. Chen's dedication to cleanliness was legendary in the neighborhood. The community rallied around them. Regular customers posted positive reviews online, and neighboring businesses kept watch for any suspicious activity. A local tech-savvy college student helped them set up security cameras, ensuring they had evidence if anyone tried to cause trouble. Amy's school life changed too. Her teachers asked her to speak at assembly about standing up for what's right. Initially nervous, she found strength in sharing her family's story. Other students, especially those from immigrant families, started coming to her with their own concerns about unfair treatment. One day, a group of law students from the local university visited the restaurant. They were studying the case as part of their ethics class. Amy listened as they discussed legal terms and precedents, understanding more than she let on. Their professor noticed her interest and invited her to visit the law school sometime. "You know," the professor told her, "the world needs lawyers who care about justice as much as you do. Have you ever thought about becoming one?" Amy hadn't, until that moment. She looked around the restaurant, at her grandmother expertly pleating dumplings, at the wall of family photos showing 3 generations of history, at the community bulletin board now filled with legal resources and warnings about scams. She realized that protecting people's rights could be just as important as feeding them. That evening, as she helped count the day's earnings, something she insisted on doing after the Morrison incident, Amy shared her new dream with her grandmother. Mrs. Chen listened quietly, then went to the back room and returned with a small red envelope. "For school," she said in English, pressing it into Amy's hands. "You learn law, help more people." Inside was a savings bond. Her grandmother had been putting aside money for years, hoping Amy would go to college someday. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of more community members for their weekly meeting. Tonight's topic was how to identify legitimate business offers from scams. Amy watched as her grandmother welcomed them, serving tea and leftover dumplings. The restaurant buzzed with conversation in multiple languages, all focused on one goal: protecting their community's future. As Amy moved between tables, translating and taking notes, she reflected on how much had changed since that day in court. Their victory hadn't just saved one restaurant, it had awakened something powerful in their community. People who had once felt powerless were finding their voice, and she was proud to be part of that change. The investigation into Morrison Legal Associates revealed a web of corruption far more extensive than anyone had imagined. As autumn arrived, bringing crisp leaves and cooler temperatures to the city, Amy noticed more and more unfamiliar faces appearing at the restaurant. They weren't just customers, they were people seeking help, each with their own story of being deceived by corrupt lawyers or fraudulent business deals. One rainy Tuesday evening, an elderly couple came in just before closing time. They reminded Amy of her own grandparents, the husband supporting his wife as they walked, both wearing weathered but carefully maintained clothes. They had lost their small grocery store 6 months ago to a scheme similar to what Morrison had attempted with the Chen family. "We didn't know who to trust," the wife explained, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea Mrs. Chen had insisted on serving. "But then we saw your story in the Chinese newspaper, and we thought maybe it's not too late for us." Amy translated their story for her grandmother, watching as Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from concern to determination. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and called Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become not just their lawyer but a trusted friend. Despite the late hour, Mrs. Rodriguez agreed to meet with the couple the next day. The district attorney's office had set up a special task force to handle cases related to Morrison's network. They discovered that dozens of small businesses, particularly those owned by immigrants, had been targeted over the past 5 years. The scheme had been sophisticated, using fake notaries, forged documents, and a network of shell companies to hide the paper trail. Amy's keen eye for detail had unknowingly pulled the first thread that would unravel the entire operation. The task force investigators frequently consulted with her, asking about small details she remembered from their own case. Her grandmother would beam with pride every time they visited, always insisting on feeding them despite their protests that they were there on official business. The community support group that had started in their restaurant was growing. They now needed to rent the community center down the street for their weekly meetings because they couldn't fit everyone in the restaurant anymore. Business owners from other neighborhoods and even nearby cities started attending, eager to learn how to protect themselves and their livelihoods. One evening, as Amy helped organize documents for a meeting, she overheard 2 women discussing how things had changed. "Before, we were all afraid," one said. "We thought being scared was normal, that we had to accept being cheated because we were immigrants. But that little girl showed us different. She showed us that even the smallest voice can speak truth to power." The comment made Amy pause. She had never thought of herself as powerful. She was just a girl who noticed something wrong and spoke up about it. But looking around the room at all the people working together, sharing stories and supporting each other, she began to understand that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. The state senator who had visited earlier returned with exciting news. She had used the Chun case as an example while pushing for new legislation to protect small business owners. The proposed law would require stricter verification of property transfers and create a special fund to provide legal assistance to immigrant business owners. "We're calling it the Chun-Morrison Act," the senator announced during a community meeting. "Because it represents both what we're fighting against and what we're fighting for." The room erupted in applause, and Mrs. Chun, usually reserved in public, wiped tears from her eyes as she received a standing ovation. But with greater visibility came new challenges. Some of Morrison's former associates, now under investigation themselves, tried to intimidate witnesses. Anonymous threatening letters began appearing at businesses that were cooperating with the investigation. The community responded by establishing a neighborhood watch program, with business owners taking turns patrolling the streets and checking on each other. Amy's school life was affected too. Some kids, whose parents were involved in the real estate industry, started avoiding her. But others were drawn to her strength, particularly those who had their own stories of injustice but had been afraid to speak up. A group of students asked for her help starting a club focused on community advocacy and immigrant rights. The local university's law school invited Amy to speak to their students about her experience. Standing at the podium, looking out at a sea of future lawyers, she felt nervous but determined. She spoke about her grandmother's signature, about the importance of details, and about how true justice requires both knowledge of the law and understanding of human dignity. "Being a lawyer isn't just about knowing laws," she told them. "It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about noticing when something is wrong and having the courage to say something." Her speech received unexpected attention when a video of it went viral on social media. News outlets picked up the story again, focusing on how a child's observation skills had launched a major investigation into legal corruption. Amy found herself being interviewed by national news networks, always insisting that her grandmother be included in the conversations. The attention brought more cases to light. Business owners from other cities began reaching out, sharing similar stories of fraud and deception. The task force expanded its investigation beyond state lines, uncovering a national network of corrupt lawyers and real estate developers who had been preying on immigrant communities for years. Mrs. Chun took it all in stride, continuing to run her restaurant with the same care and attention to detail she always had. But Amy noticed small changes. Her grandmother walked taller now, spoke more confidently in her limited English, and had become a respected leader in the community. She had even started taking English classes at the local community center, determined to be able to tell her own story without needing translation. One evening, as they were closing up the restaurant, a young girl about Amy's age came in with her mother. They had just moved to the neighborhood and heard about the community support group. As Amy watched her grandmother welcome them, serving warm tea and leftover dumplings just as she had done countless times before, she realized something important. Their story wasn't just about exposing one corrupt lawyer or saving one family restaurant. It was about showing people that they didn't have to face injustice alone, that even the smallest voice could make a difference when supported by a community standing together. Winter settled over the city, but the warmth inside the Chun family restaurant never dimmed. The investigation into Morrison's network had grown into one of the largest fraud cases in the state's history. As more evidence emerged, the true scope of the corruption became clear. It wasn't just about stolen properties, but about systematic exploitation of vulnerable communities. One snowy morning, Amy arrived at the restaurant to find her grandmother already busy in the kitchen, preparing something special. The air was filled with the aroma of herbs and spices she hadn't smelled in a long time. "Today important day," Mrs. Chun explained, carefully folding dumplings with practiced hands. Many people come. We make grandfather's special recipe. Amy understood the significance immediately. Her grandfather's secret recipe had been reserved for only the most important celebrations. Today was the day the state legislature would vote on the Chin-Morrison Act, and community members were gathering to watch the live stream together. The restaurant quickly filled with familiar faces, business owners, lawyers, community activists, and families who had been affected by Morrison's schemes. Someone had set up a projector screen on one wall, and Mrs. Rodriguez arrived early to explain the legislative process to everyone. As they waited for the session to begin, Amy helped serve her grandfather's special dumplings. She listened to the conversations around her, stories of loss, hope, and resilience. A Korean restaurant owner described how his father had lost their first restaurant to a similar scheme 20 years ago. "Back then, we had no one to help us," he said. "Now, because of you and your grandmother, things are different." The legislative session began, and the room fell silent. The state senator who had championed their cause stood to speak, holding up a photograph of the Chen family restaurant. She described how a young girl's attention to detail had exposed a criminal enterprise that had preyed on immigrant communities for years. "This legislation," the senator declared, "is about more than just protecting businesses. It's about protecting the American dream itself, the idea that anyone, regardless of where they come from or what language they speak, can build a life here through honest work and determination." As the debate continued, Amy noticed her grandmother quietly wiping tears from her eyes. She reached for her hand, feeling the calluses earned from decades of cooking and hard work. Mrs. Chen squeezed back, whispering in Chinese, "Your grandfather would be so proud today." The voting began, and everyone in the restaurant held their breath. When the final tally appeared on screen, the bill had passed with overwhelming support. The room erupted in cheers. People hugged each other, some crying, others laughing. Mrs. Chen was immediately surrounded by well-wishers, but Amy saw her looking at the old photograph of grandfather on the wall, nodding slightly as if sharing the moment with him. The celebration was interrupted by breaking news. Federal prosecutors had just announced indictments against 37 people connected to Morrison's network, including several prominent real estate developers and corrupt officials who had enabled the schemes. The investigation that had started with one fake signature had uncovered a nationwide criminal enterprise. That evening, as the celebration continued, Amy noticed a quiet conversation in the corner. Mrs. Rodriguez was speaking with several business owners who had lost their properties before the Chen case. They were discussing the possibility of filing a class action lawsuit to recover their losses. The law might not be able to undo all the damage that had been done, but it could offer some measure of justice. A local high school teacher asked Amy to speak to her civics class about civic responsibility and community activism. Standing before her peers, Amy shared not just her story, but the lessons she had learned about the power of observation and the importance of speaking up for others. "Sometimes people think you need to be special to make a difference," she told the class. "But that's not true. You just need to pay attention and care about what's happening around you. Every big change starts with someone noticing something small and having the courage to say something about it." The next morning brought more surprises. A national organization focusing on immigrant rights announced they were establishing a legal defense fund named after Mrs. Chen. The fund would provide resources for immigrant business owners facing fraudulent schemes or legal challenges. They asked Amy's grandmother to serve on the advisory board, with Amy as her official translator. The restaurant's regular customers noticed changes too. Mrs. Chen had started labeling menu items in both Chinese and English, with Amy's help. She had even begun greeting customers in English, her confidence growing day by day. The weekend cooking classes she had always offered to neighborhood children now included lessons about business ownership and the importance of understanding legal documents. One afternoon, a group of law students from the university arrived with an unusual request. They wanted to document the Chen case as part of a project on community justice. As they interviewed regular customers and community members, Amy realized their story had become something larger than herself or her grandmother. It had become a symbol of hope and resistance. The students were particularly interested in the weekly community meetings that had started in their restaurant. These gatherings had evolved into a powerful network of mutual support and education. Business owners shared their experiences, lawyers offered pro bono advice, and everyone looked out for signs of suspicious activity in the community. What's most remarkable, one of the law students noted, is how this case has changed the relationship between the legal community and immigrant business owners. Instead of fear and distrust, there's now collaboration and understanding. Amy thought about this as she helped her grandmother close the restaurant that evening. The kitchen still smelled of grandfather's special dumplings, and the warmth of the day's celebrations lingered in the air. On the community bulletin board, notices about legal workshops and business education classes had replaced the warnings about scams. Her grandmother called her over to help with something. She was teaching 2 new restaurant owners how to review a lease agreement, pointing out the important details they needed to check. Amy watched as her grandmother confidently explained each section, her English simple but clear. The transformation in her grandmother was perhaps the most remarkable change of all, from a victim of fraud to a community leader helping others protect themselves. Spring arrived, bringing with it unexpected changes to the Chen family's story. One morning, as cherry blossoms drifted past the restaurant windows, Amy arrived to find her grandmother in an unusually serious mood. She was holding a letter from the governor's office. "They want us to attend a special ceremony," Amy read aloud, translating the formal language for her grandmother. The state was establishing a new office of small business protection, and they wanted Mrs. Chen to speak at the inauguration. The letter mentioned how their case had become a catalyst for change across the state. But what caught Amy's attention was the handwritten note at the bottom. Morrison's former junior associate, the young lawyer who had spoken up in court that day, had been appointed to lead the new office's legal compliance division. He had specifically requested the Chen family's presence at the ceremony. The news sparked mixed reactions in the community. Some were skeptical about trusting anyone connected to Morrison, but others saw it as a sign of real change. Mrs. Chen listened to everyone's opinions during their weekly community meeting, nodding thoughtfully as Amy translated the heated discussions. "Sometimes," Mrs. Chen said in her improving English, "brave person can be on wrong side first. Important thing is choosing right path when you see truth." The ceremony was scheduled for the following week at the state capitol. As Amy helped her grandmother prepare for the event, they received surprising news. 3 more of Morrison's former associates had come forward with evidence of similar schemes in other states. The investigation had grown into a federal case, with implications reaching far beyond their small community. The morning of the ceremony, Amy and her grandmother arrived at the Capitol building to find it filled with familiar faces. Business owners from their community meetings were there, along with lawyers, activists, and families who had been affected by Morrison's schemes. Many had traveled from other cities and states to witness this moment. The former junior associate, now dressed in a modest suit rather than the expensive ones Morrison had favored, approached them before the ceremony. He looked nervous, clutching a folder to his chest. "Mrs. Chen," he began, then switched to simple Mandarin that Amy could tell he had practiced. "I want to apologize properly in your language." Mrs. Chen listened as he struggled through his prepared speech, her expression softening. When he finished, she patted his arm and said in English, "Past is past. Now you help others. This most important." The ceremony itself was more than just the inauguration of a new office. It became a celebration of community resilience and the power of speaking up against injustice. The governor spoke about how the Chen case had exposed not just criminal behavior, but the need for systematic change in how the state protected vulnerable business owners. The former junior associate's speech surprised everyone. He didn't just talk about legal reforms or new protection measures. Instead, he shared his own story of moral awakening, sparked by watching an 11-year-old girl stand up for what was right while he had remained silent. "I had all the legal training, all the credentials," he admitted. "But it took a child's courage to show me the true meaning of justice. Sometimes the law isn't just about what's written in books, it's about protecting people's dreams and life's work." After the ceremony, several national news outlets interviewed Amy and her grandmother. One reporter asked Mrs. Chen what she would say to other immigrant business owners facing similar challenges. Her response, delivered in careful English with Amy providing translation for the complex parts, moved many to tears. "American dream not just about making money," she said. "It about making community. When we help each other, stand together, nobody can break us. My granddaughter teach me, small voice can make big change if speak truth." Back at the restaurant that evening, they found a surprise waiting. The community had organized a celebration of their own. The street was filled with tables from different restaurants, Korean barbecue next to Italian pasta, Vietnamese pho beside Mexican tacos. Every business owner who had been helped by their case had brought something to share. A local artist had painted a mural on the wall opposite the restaurant, depicting a small girl standing tall in a courtroom, with a diverse group of people standing behind her. Below it, in multiple languages, were the words, "Truth has no size. Justice has no language." As the celebration continued into the evening, Amy noticed something significant. The conversations around her weren't just about past victories, they were about the future. Business owners were discussing expansion plans, sharing advice about legitimate investors, and talking about teaching the next generation to be vigilant and confident. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become a regular at their community gatherings, pulled Amy aside to share some news. The State Bar Association was developing a new ethics training program based on the Morrison case. Future lawyers would learn about the importance of cultural competency and the responsibility to protect vulnerable clients. "And guess what?" Mrs. Rodriguez added with a smile. "They want you to record a video message for the training. Your story will be part of every new lawyer's education in this state." The impact of their case continued to ripple outward. Other states began contacting the new Office of Small Business Protection, looking to replicate their model. The Legal Defense Fund named after Mrs. Chen had already helped prevent 3 similar fraud attempts in other cities. That night, after the celebrations wound down, Amy and her grandmother sat at their favorite table in the empty restaurant. Mrs. Chen brought out a special tea set, one that had belonged to Amy's great-grandmother in China. "Time for important talk," she said, pouring the tea with practiced grace. "You growing up, becoming strong voice for community. Need to think about future." She pulled out a savings account statement. The community's gratitude had often come in the form of donations to Amy's college fund, despite their protests. The amount had grown substantial enough to cover not just college, but possibly law school as well. "Your grandfather always say, education is key that opens many doors," Mrs. Chen continued. "Now you have key. But remember, knowledge without compassion is like recipe without soul. No matter what you choose, always keep heart that sees truth." As they sipped their tea, Amy looked around the restaurant, at the walls lined with family photos and community awards, at the bulletin board filled with legal resources and business workshops, at the new security cameras that now protected not just their business but the entire street. Everything had changed, yet the core of what made this place special remained the same, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the strength that comes from standing together. 1 year had passed since that fateful day in the courtroom. The Chen family restaurant buzzed with its usual weekend energy, but today was special. Community members, lawyers, business owners, and families gathered for what had become an annual celebration of justice and community solidarity. The occasion marked not just the anniversary of their court victory, but the first successful year of the new Small Business Protection Office. The changes their case had sparked had grown far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Morrison, who had finally faced trial, had been sentenced to 15 years in prison. More importantly, the systematic changes implemented in the wake of their case had prevented countless other families from facing similar schemes. Amy, now 12, moved through the crowded restaurant with practiced ease, helping her grandmother serve special anniversary dumplings. She paused near the entrance, where new photographs had been added to the wall. Among them was a newspaper clipping with the headline "National Anti-Fraud Act Inspired by Local Girls' Courage," alongside pictures of their community celebrations and meetings. Mrs. Chen had transformed too. She now conducted portions of their community meetings in English, her confidence growing with each session. The restaurant had become a model for other immigrant-owned businesses, with regular workshops on everything from legal rights to business expansion strategies. The bell above the door chimed as a familiar face entered, the former junior associate from Morrison's firm, now heading the legal compliance division. He carried a thick folder under his arm and a look of excitement on his face. "The federal program is official," he announced to the gathered crowd. "Starting next month, every state will have a dedicated task force focusing on protecting immigrant-owned businesses. They're using our community support model as the template." The news was met with applause, but Amy noticed something else in the room: the proud looks exchanged between older community members who had once been too afraid to speak up. They had found their voices, and now they were helping others find theirs too. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had become like family over the past year, stood up to share her own announcement. The legal clinic they had started in the community center had helped recover over 20 properties stolen through similar schemes. But more than that, it had created a network of support that stretched across state lines. "But today's biggest news," Mrs. Rodriguez said with a smile, "comes from our youngest community member." She gestured for Amy to join her. Amy felt her cheeks flush as she walked to the front of the room. The previous week, she had entered a national essay competition about civic responsibility. Her piece, titled "The Power of Small Details," had won first place. The prize included a scholarship and the opportunity to speak at a national conference on community justice. "None of this was in my plan," Amy began, looking around at the familiar faces. "I just knew my grandmother's signature. I just knew something wasn't right. But sometimes the smallest things we notice can lead to the biggest changes." She went on to explain how their story had inspired similar movements in other cities. Immigrant business communities across the country had started their own support networks, legal education programs, and advocacy groups. The ripple effect of one court case had turned into a wave of change. Mrs. Chen watched her granddaughter speak with tears in her eyes. Later, she would tell Amy how much she reminded her of her grandfather, not just in her love for justice, but in her ability to bring people together. The celebration continued as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the restaurant windows. Different community members stood to share their stories, not just of past struggles, but of recent victories. A Vietnamese family had successfully expanded their faux restaurant into a second location. A Mexican grocery store owner had helped expose another fraud attempt in a neighboring city. An Indian restaurant had started offering free meals to law students who volunteered at the community legal clinic. As evening approached, Mrs. Chen gathered everyone for a special ceremony. She had prepared traditional red envelopes, but instead of money, each contained a small card with a message she had written herself in both Chinese and English: "Truth needs no language. Justice knows no borders. Community has no limits." The former junior associate stood to make one final announcement. The State Bar Association had created a new award for ethical legal practice in immigrant communities. To everyone's surprise, they had named it the Chen Integrity Award. "But the real award," he said, looking at Amy and her grandmother, "is seeing how one family's courage has changed thousands of lives. You didn't just win a court case, you started a movement." As the celebration wound down, Amy helped her grandmother clean up, just as she had done countless times before. But now their conversations were different. mixing Chinese and English, discussing legal terms alongside cooking techniques, planning community workshops between preparing ingredients for the next day. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9, approached them as they worked. She was the daughter of a newly arrived family that had joined their community meetings. "Is it true?" she asked Amy. "Did you really stand up to a bad lawyer when you were my age?" Amy smiled, remembering how scared she had been that day in court. "I just told the truth about what I saw," she replied. "Sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference." The girl's eyes widened. "My mom says you're the reason we could open our store safely. She says you showed everyone that even kids can fight for justice." Mrs. Chen, overhearing the conversation, added in her improved English, "Not just fight for justice. Build community. Make change. This most important lesson." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Amy and her grandmother sat at their special table. The restaurant was quiet except for the gentle clinking of teacups. Through the window, they could see the mural across the street, now accompanied by similar artworks along the block, each telling a story of community resilience and hope. "1 year ago," Mrs. Chen said softly, "I think we lose everything. Now look, we gain whole world of family." Amy nodded, understanding that their story wasn't just about exposing one corrupt lawyer or saving one family restaurant. It was about showing that justice wasn't just found in courtrooms or law books. It lived in the courage of ordinary people standing together, in the careful observation of details that others might miss, and in the belief that even the smallest voice could spark the biggest changes. As they finished their tea, the first stars appearing in the sky outside, Amy realized that their victory hadn't just changed their community, it had shown that the true power of justice came not from the strength of one voice, but from the harmony of many voices speaking together. Their restaurant had become more than a place to eat, it was a symbol of hope, a center of community strength, and a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest acts of courage.